At 70 years old, Walter Hayes had learned not to argue with people who had already decided what they were looking at. That September morning, three men stood beside the gravel road at the edge of his farm, staring past him toward the open equipment shed. Inside sat a tractor that looked older than anything else, still working in the county. Its red paint had faded into patches of rust and dull orange. The seat had been repaired twice with strips of black vinyl. One headlight was newer than the other. The hood carried dents Walter could remember getting and others that had happened before he was old enough to drive. The tractor was nearly 80 years old. Walter was 70. To the men by the road, the comparison was too easy. "You're really taking that thing into harvest?" Walter kept wiping grease from his fingers. "That's the plan." One of the men glanced toward a neighboring field, where a newer diesel machine was already moving through the morning haze. "You know, there comes a point when keeping old equipment costs more than replacing it." Walter folded the rag once. Then again, he had heard versions of that sentence for years. The same people had begun saying something similar about him. His knees were slower now. His right shoulder hurt when the weather changed. Climbing onto the tractor took longer than it had 20 years earlier. His son had suggested hiring more help. A machinery salesman had offered numbers on a newer tractor. Even Walter's doctor had told him that 70 was an age when a man needed to be more careful about how many hours he spent in heat and dust. Nobody had said he was finished. They didn't have to. Walter could hear it in the pauses. He walked into the shed. The old tractor smelled of steel, dust, oil, and gasoline, the same mixture that had followed him through most of his adult life. He raised the hood, not dramatically, not sentimentally. He checked the machine the way he checked it every morning before important work. Oil first, then coolant. He pressed a thumb against the fan belt. Feeling its tension, he ran his fingers along the fuel line. He checked the battery terminals, then crouched beside the rear wheel and looked for fresh leaks underneath the housing. On a wooden bench nearby sat a gray metal toolbox. Walter opened it. Inside were ordinary things: wrenches worn smooth at the edges, pliers, wire, spare bolts, hose clamps, a length of fuel line, an old fan belt wrapped in paper, and several small parts labeled in Walter's handwriting. To anyone else, it looked like clutter. To Walter, it was a map of everything that had stopped this tractor before. Atshaze, patruzeci și șapte. He climbed into the seat. He opened the fuel, set the controls, and pressed the starter. The engine turned. Once, twice. Nothing. One of the men near the road laughed. Not cruelly. That almost made it worse. Walter waited. He listened. Then he adjusted the choke slightly and tried again. The starter turned over. The engine coughed once, followed by a second hard cough. Then the old four-cylinder came alive. The entire tractor shuddered beneath him. A gray breath of exhaust rose above the shed roof. Walter didn't smile. He listened. That was something younger operators never understood about him. He did not simply hear an engine running. He heard the spacing between the firing strokes, the faint rattle near the hood, the speed of the idle, the little vibration that traveled through the steering column and into his palms. After 50 years with machines, Walter knew that a tractor could tell a man quite a lot before it broke, but only if the man had learned its language. He let the engine warm while the sun climbed over the corn. Across the county, newer machines were starting too. Machines with enclosed cabs, air conditioning, electronic monitors. More horsepower than Walter's tractor could have dreamed of producing. They were faster, stronger, more comfortable. And Walter knew every one of those facts. He had no illusion that his old tractor was better. He only knew something the men by the road had forgotten. Harvest was not won by the machine that looked strongest before the first field was cut. Harvest was won by whatever was still moving when the last good day ran out. Walter pushed the clutch down and eased the tractor into gear. Behind him, the empty wagon rattled onto the gravel. In front of him waited the first field. And beyond it, clouds were already beginning to gather. The tractor had belonged to Walter long before anyone began calling it old. His father bought it used when Walter was 12. Back then, the machine had already worked somebody else's fields for years. Its paint was brighter. The steering wheel had no cracks. and the seat still had enough padding that a boy could ride on the fender without complaining. Walter remembered the first time his father let him drive it alone. The field was flat, the job simple, and his father walked beside the tractor for nearly half the row before finally stepping back. "Don't fight the wheel," he had said. "Feel where it wants to go." Walter had not understood the sentence then. He did now. Over the next 5 decades, the tractor became part of nearly every difficult season. The farm survived. It pulled a wagon during the wet fall of 1978, when half the field seemed determined to swallow every tire that touched it. It hauled fence posts after a spring storm flattened the north pasture. It ran an auger through harvests when grain prices were barely high enough to justify the diesel. It dragged dead trees away from the creek. It carried Walter home one October evening when his father collapsed in the barn, and Walter had no truck close enough to reach quickly. That was the year the farm stopped belonging to 2 men and started belonging to 1. Walter never told people that story when they asked why he kept the tractor. Sentiment was too easy an answer. Sentiment did not keep bearings greased. It did not stop fuel lines from cracking. It did not explain why a machine built before most of the county roads were paved could still pull a wagon 70 years later. What kept the tractor alive was attention. Walter had rebuilt the carburetor twice, replaced the water pump 3 times, changed hoses before they split, adjusted the clutch when the pedal began traveling too far. He knew which rear seal liked to seep when the weather turned cold. He knew the starter sounded slower when the battery connections needed cleaning. He knew the engine developed a faint metallic tick long before one particular bolt worked itself loose. Most of those things were not written in any manual. They were learned one breakdown at a time. Walter's grandson, Evan, came into the shed that afternoon, carrying 2 bottles of water. He was 24 and had grown up around equipment far newer than Walter's tractor. He set 1 bottle on the workbench. "You ever think about selling it?" Walter did not look up. "I think about selling everything." Evan laughed. "I'm serious." "So am I." Walter tightened a grease fitting and wiped his thumb against the rag. Evan leaned against the fender. "A newer tractor would start easier." "Yes." "Pull more." "Yes." "Use less fuel for the work." "Probably." "And have a cab." Walter looked at him. "That part I've noticed?" Evan smiled, then nodded toward the old machine. "So why this one?" Walter paused. Not because he did not know the answer, because he had too many answers. Finally, he tapped 2 fingers against the side of the hood. "Because when this one has a problem, I usually know where to look." Evan glanced at the engine. Walter continued. "I know what normal sounds like. I know what hot smells like. I know how much play should be in that linkage. I know when that belt is getting tired before it breaks." He opened the gray toolbox. Inside, every spare part had a reason for being there. A fuel line, because one had split during soybean harvest 14 years earlier. A fan belt because another had failed 2 miles from the barn. Extra hose clamps because the cheap ones once cost Walter half a day. Nothing in the box was theory. Every item had been paid for with lost time. Walter picked up the spare belt. "You see junk?" Evan shook his head. "I didn't say that." "No. But most people do." Walter laid the belt back down. "The tractor isn't valuable because it's old." He closed the toolbox. "It's valuable because there aren't many surprises left in it." Outside, across the road, the neighboring farm's new tractor moved through the field twice as fast as Walter ever could. Evan watched it for a moment. Then he looked back at the faded hood in front of him. For the first time, the old machine seemed less like a relic, and more like a book Walter had been reading for 50 years. A book nobody else knew how to read. 2 days before harvest, Walter spent nearly 4 hours doing work that looked, to Evan, like nothing. He did not plow. He did not haul grain. He did not move a single bale. He simply went over the tractor. Slowly, methodically, the hood came up first. Walter checked the radiator fins for chaff and dirt, blowing them clean with compressed air. He inspected the fan belt again, this time turning it by hand and looking for small cracks along the inside edge. Then he moved lower. Fuel line, clamps, battery cable, throttle linkage, grease points. Every place where vibration, Heat, dust, or age could turn a 10-minute problem into a lost afternoon. Evan watched from the doorway. You checked half that stuff yesterday? Walter kept working. Yesterday wasn't harvest. That make the belt older? Walter looked back at him. No. Then what changes? Walter tightened one bolt and stood. Consequences. Evan frowned. Walter pointed toward the fields. If that belt breaks today, I lose an hour. He pointed farther west, where corn waited beneath the pale September sky. If it breaks when everybody's running and rain is 3 days out, I lose whatever comes after that hour. That was how Walter thought about harvest. Not in horsepower, not in acres per hour. In interruptions, he had spent enough years farming to understand that breakdowns were rarely dramatic. Most started small. A loose clamp, a worn bearing, a cracked hose, a bad connection. Something worth $10 could stop a machine worth thousands if it failed at the wrong moment. Walter could not prevent everything, but he could reduce surprises. He opened the gray toolbox and began removing parts: a spar fan belt, fuel hose, electrical wire, fuses, clamps, cotter pins, 2 bearings, a box of bolts sorted by size. Evan picked up one of the bearings. You just carry all this around? Not all the time. During harvest? Yes. Why? Walter gave him a look. Because a part sitting in town is useless when I'm 2 fields away. He walked to the shelf behind the workbench and pulled down a stained repair manual. The cover was nearly detached. Pages had been marked with pencil. Measurements, part numbers, dates. Besides several entries, Walter had written his own notes. Replace before fall. Check after 50 hours. Heat here means bearing. Vibration at low idle, inspect mount. Evan flipped through the pages. You wrote more in this thing than the manufacturer did. Manufacturer didn't own this tractor for 50 years. That was the difference nobody saw when they looked at the old machine. A tractor was not only steel and gears, it was also the accumulated record of what had failed before. Every broken part had taught Walter something. Every repair had removed one mystery. The old tractor still had weaknesses. Plenty of them. Its engine produced a fraction of the power of modern equipment. It had no air conditioning, no electronic diagnostics, no computer telling Walter when something was wrong. But that simplicity worked both ways. When the engine stopped, Walter did not need a laptop to begin asking questions. Was it getting fuel? Was it getting spark? Was something overheating? Was air restricted? Was a mechanical connection loose? The system was small enough for him to understand. That did not make it superior. It made it familiar. Late that afternoon, Evan helped Walter hitch a grain wagon. As Walter backed toward the tongue, the tractor suddenly stumbled at idle. Only once. A brief hesitation. Evan barely noticed. Walter did. He stopped immediately. What? Walter listened. The engine settled again. He increased the throttle slightly. Another hesitation. Walter shut it down. Within 10 minutes, he had removed the sediment bowl beneath the fuel tank. A thin line of dirt had collected near the outlet. Not enough to stop the tractor. Not yet. Walter cleaned the bowl, flushed the line, reassembled it, and restarted the engine. The idle became steady. Evan stared at him. You heard that? Walter nodded. I heard something wasn't right. You knew it was fuel? No. That answer surprised him. Walter wiped his hands. I knew where to start looking. There was a difference. Experience did not mean knowing everything. It meant knowing which question to ask first. By sunset, the tractor was ready, or as ready as an 80-year-old tractor could ever be. Walter parked it inside the shed and placed the toolbox behind the seat. Evan stood beside him, looking at the faded paint differently now. A modern machine could tell its operator when a sensor detected trouble. Walter's tractor had no sensors. It had something else. A man who had spent half a century learning what trouble sounded like before it arrived, and harvest was only 48 hours away. Harvest started under a clear sky. By 7 in the morning, the road in front of Walter's farm was already busy. Diesel engines rolled through the valley. Large grain carts moved between fields. A newer tractor from the Mercer farm passed Walter's mailbox, pulling a wagon twice the size of his own. The cab was sealed. The windows were clean. A GPS receiver sat above the roofline. Inside, The operator wore a t-shirt and baseball cap, protected from the dust by glass and air conditioning. Walter watched it pass from the seat of his tractor. Evan stood on the drawbar behind him. That thing probably has more horsepower than 3 of these. Walter looked at the Mercer tractor disappearing down the road. More than that, there was no bitterness in his voice. Walter had driven modern equipment. He understood exactly why farmers bought it. A newer tractor could pull heavier loads. A modern combine could harvest more acres in an hour than Walter's father might have managed in most of a day. Electronic controls reduced fatigue. Guidance systems helped operators hold straighter lines. Better hydraulics made equipment easier to handle. Climate-controlled cabs allowed a man to work longer without breathing dust for 10 hours straight. Progress was real. Walter never pretended otherwise. By mid-morning, the difference was impossible to ignore. Across the road, the Mercer Farms combine moved through corn. With mechanical confidence, row after row disappeared beneath the header. The grain tank filled. The auger swung out. A tractor and grain cart pulled alongside without the combine stopping. Corn poured into the cart while both machines continued moving. Evan watched from Walter's field. They don't even stop. No? That's ridiculous. Walter almost smiled. It's efficient. Meanwhile, Walter's operation looked like something from another era. His tractor pulled a modest wagon. When the wagon was full, he drove it out, unloaded, returned, hitched again. Every movement required time. Every turn at the edge of the field had to be planned because the old tractor did not respond as quickly as newer machines. By noon, Mercer had covered more ground than Walter expected to finish all day. Evan finally said what both of them were thinking. If speed decides this, we lose. Walter lifted his water bottle. Lose what? Evan looked at him. The harvest. Walter drank before answering. Harvest isn't a race against Mercer. Then what is it a race against? Walter looked toward the western horizon. The sky was still blue, but he had checked the forecast twice that morning. A front was moving in. The first prediction had called for rain late in the week. The newest one had moved it closer. 3 days. Maybe 4. Walter pointed toward the field. We're racing that. Evan followed his hand. For the first time that day, he stopped watching the big machines. Walter had learned long ago that harvest had its own clock. Corn could wait, but not forever. Grain moisture mattered. Field conditions mattered. Rain could turn firm soil into mud. A damaged machine could sit for half a day, while a perfect harvesting window disappeared around it. That was why Walter never measured a season only by how much equipment could do in 1 hour. He measured how many useful hours he could keep. That afternoon, the Mercer combine passed the edge of Walter's property again. The operator lifted one hand from inside the cab. Walter returned the wave. Evan watched the enormous machine disappear behind a curtain of dust. You really don't wish you had one? Walter glanced at him. I'd take one tomorrow. Evan laughed. I thought you loved this tractor. I do. Then why replace it? Walter eased the throttle back as they approached the end of the row. Loving a tool doesn't mean pretending it can do things it can't. He turned the tractor slowly. That machine over there is faster. He straightened the wagon behind them. Mine has one advantage. Evan waited. Walter said nothing else. Not yet. The old tractor settled back into its steady rhythm. Slow. Noisy. Unimpressive. Across the county, expensive machines were eating through fields faster than Walter could hope to match. By every visible measure, he was already behind. Then, just after 4 o'clock, the weather radio in the barn changed the forecast. The rain was no longer 3 days away. It might arrive in 48 hours. The new forecast changed everything. 48 hours was not much time. Not for Walter. Not with his acreage. Not with a tractor that needed patience every morning before it decided to cooperate. By 5 o'clock, the light had started to soften across the fields. But Walter did not go inside. Instead, he drove the tractor back to the shed. Evan followed. We still have daylight. Walter shut the engine down. I know. We could get another load out. Walter climbed slowly from the seat. Maybe. Evan looked toward the field. So why stop? Walter opened the hood. Because I'd rather lose 40 minutes now than 4 hours tomorrow. That was the part of harvest most people never saw. The waiting, the checking, The small decisions made while nothing appeared to be happening. Walter pulled a flashlight from the bench and began at the front of the tractor. Radiator first. The fins were already collecting a layer of chaff. He blew them clean. Then he checked the fan belt. Still tight. No new cracks. He touched the upper radiator hose. Warm, but not swollen. Then he crouched near the fuel system and looked for dampness around the fittings. Evan stood beside him. You already checked all that. This morning. And? Walter pointed at the dust covering the tractor. Machine worked 10 hours since then. He moved to the rear axle. Grease. Pins. Hitch. Drawbar. Nothing dramatic. Nothing broken. That was exactly what Walter wanted. His goal was not to repair the tractor after something failed. His goal was to catch the things that were trying to fail before morning. He took a wrench and checked a mounting bolt near the engine. It moved slightly, barely enough to notice. Walter tightened it. Evan watched. That would have stopped us? Probably not. So why bother? Walter set the wrench down. Because loose becomes looser. That was Walter's entire philosophy of machinery. Small problems rarely stayed small because a farmer was busy. Vibration did not care that rain was coming. Heat did not wait until the field was finished. Rubber did not postpone cracking because the forecast was bad. The machine had no interest in Walter's schedule, so Walter had learned to respect its own. He walked to the gray toolbox. This time, he did not simply check what was inside. He reorganized it. The tools he was most likely to need went on top. Fuel wrench, pliers, adjustable wrench, screwdriver, wire, clamps. Below them, he packed the spare belt, hose, and bearing. Then he added 2 bottles of water and an old rag. Evan smiled. Planning to live out there? For 2 days. Maybe? Walter shut the box. Across the road, lights had come on in the Mercer shed. Their newer machines were being fueled and serviced too. Walter could hear the distant clatter of an impact wrench. For a moment, Evan watched the activity. They're preparing too. Of course they are. Walter never believed modern equipment made people careless. Good farmers maintain new machines just as carefully as old ones. But there was still a difference. When something serious failed on Walter's tractor, he usually knew what he was looking at. When a specialized electronic component failed on a newer machine, the operator might know exactly what the problem was and still be unable to fix it without the correct part. Diagnostic equipment, or service support. That did not make the new machine worse. It made the consequence of certain failures different. Walter checked the weather radio again before bed. The front had accelerated. Rain now looked likely by late the next evening. Evan stared at the forecast. That's not 48 hours. No. How much do we have? Walter looked at the clock. Depends when the clouds decide we're done. At 4:52 the next morning, the kitchen light came on. Walter ate 2 eggs, half a piece of toast, and drank coffee standing at the counter. $5:21. He was in the shed. He checked the oil, opened the fuel, turned the ignition. The engine caught on the second attempt. By sunrise, they were moving. For 6 hours. The old tractor did exactly what Walter asked. Load, pull, unload, return, load again. The rhythm became mechanical, slow, but steady. Then, shortly after noon, Walter felt something change through the clutch pedal. Not a sound, not smoke, not a warning light, just a faint shudder that had not been there that morning. He eased off the throttle. Evan looked over. What is it? Walter pressed the clutch again. The vibration returned. This time stronger. He stopped the tractor in the middle of the field. Behind them sat a loaded wagon. Above them, the western sky had begun to turn gray. Walter climbed down. Evan followed. Can we keep going? Walter crouched beside the tractor and placed one hand against the housing. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked toward the toolbox. No. Evan's face tightened. How bad? Walter reached for a wrench. We're about to find out. Walter lay on his back in the dirt beneath the tractor while the loaded wagon waited behind him. Above the field, the sky had turned from gray to the dull blue-black color that usually meant weather was no longer a forecast. It was coming. Evan crouched beside the front wheel. What do you see? Nothing yet. That's helpful. Walter ignored him. He pressed one hand against the clutch housing and moved the pedal with the other. There it was again. A faint vibration. Not enough to shake the tractor. Just enough to tell him something in the linkage was no longer sitting where it should. He slid farther underneath. The old tractor had no computer to explain what was wrong. No warning code. No electronic message. That meant Walter had to reduce the problem one piece at a time. The engine had been running normally. No overheating. No loss of power. No fuel hesitation. The vibration appeared only when the clutch pedal moved. So Walter stopped thinking about the engine. He followed the linkage instead. Pedal. Rod. Pivot. Connection. He wiped away a layer of dust and grease. Then he found it. A pin in the clutch linkage had worn enough to move sideways inside its bracket. The retaining clip was almost gone. One more hour of vibration and the pin might have worked itself free completely. If that happened, Walter could lose control of the clutch linkage. Evan leaned closer. That it? Walter pointed. See that movement? Evan pressed the pedal. The pin shifted. Yeah. That shouldn't move like that. Can we fix it? Walter crawled out. If the toolbox has what I think it has. He opened the gray box behind the seat. For years, Walter had carried small pieces that looked almost worthless to anyone else. Washers, cotter pins, retaining clips, short lengths of wire, old bolts. Parts too cheap to justify driving 20 miles to buy one at a time. He dumped several into his palm. Evan stared. You actually have one? Walter chose a pin that matched the diameter, not the exact one. That a problem? It will be if I pretend it's permanent. He removed the worn piece, cleaned the bracket, checked the hole for damage, then fitted the replacement. A washer took up the extra side play. A new cotter pin locked it in place. Walter pressed the pedal. Smooth. Again. No vibration. He checked it a third time. Then he stood. Evan looked at his watch. 23 minutes. Walter wiped his hands. 26 by the time we're moving. That's it? For now. Evan looked at the old part lying in the dirt. Something that small had almost stopped the tractor. Walter picked it up and dropped it into the toolbox instead of throwing it away. Why keep that? So I remember what failed. That answer stayed with Evan. They climbed back aboard. The tractor started. Walter pressed the clutch. No shudder. He eased into gear and pulled the loaded wagon toward the road. For the next 3 hours, the machine kept working. Nothing remarkable happened. That was the remarkable part. Across the county, harvest depended on thousands of components doing their jobs at the same time. Belts, bearings, pins, sensors, hydraulic lines, electrical connections. Any one of them could stop a machine far more powerful than itself. Walter had learned never to judge a breakdown by the price of the part. He judged it by the hours it could steal. By late afternoon, the wind had strengthened. Corn leaves turned their pale undersides toward the sky. Evan checked his phone. Rain lines 20 miles west. Walter nodded. How many loads left? 3. If everything goes right. Evan glanced at the tractor. And if it doesn't? Walter looked at him. Then we fix what we can. They returned to the field. One load, then another. The old tractor moved slower than nearly every machine around it. But it moved. Just before sunset, they passed the Mercer farm entrance. A service truck was parked beside the large modern tractor they had watched all week. Its hood was raised. 2 men stood beside it. One held a diagnostic tablet. The other was on the phone. Evan turned in his seat to keep looking. Walter did not. Did you see that? Yes. What happened? No idea. Evan looked back at him. For the first time, he understood the difference Walter had been trying to explain. It was not that old machines did not break. Walter's had broken less than 4 hours earlier. The difference was that Walter had known where to begin, and 26 minutes later, he had been moving again. Behind them, the service truck's lights flashed against the darkening field. Ahead, Walter still had 1 load left, and the first drops of rain had begun to strike the hood. The rain lasted less than an hour, just enough to darken the soil, just enough to make everyone nervous. Bedum. The wind had dried the surface enough for equipment to move again. and Walter was back in the tractor before the sun cleared the trees. Evan rode with him. Neither man talked much. They had one section left to finish before the next front arrived. The tractor settled into its familiar rhythm. Engine, transmission, wagon, gravel, field. Walter had heard those sounds so many times that he no longer listened to them one by one. He listened to the pattern. That was why. Sometime after 9, he heard something Evan did not. A light metallic tick. Once, then nothing. Walter turned his head slightly. Evan noticed. What? Walter raised one hand. Listen. They continued another 30 yards. The engine sounded normal. The exhaust beat was even. The tractor pulled without hesitation. Evan waited. I don't hear anything. Walter did. Dick. Dick. Then silence again. He eased the throttle back. The sound disappeared. He increased it slowly. There. A faint rattle from the right side of the hood. Walter stopped. Evan looked toward the field behind them. We're stopping for that? Walter shut the engine off. For now. They climbed down. Walter opened the hood and began checking the obvious places first. Nothing loose near the fan. No damaged belt. No leak. He moved his hand carefully along the engine mounts. Then he found a slight movement where a bracket met the frame. One bolt had begun backing out. Not much. Maybe 2 turns. Enough to let the bracket vibrate at a particular engine speed. Evan stared at it. That was the noise? Walter touched the bolt with his finger. Probably. Walter looked at him. You don't marry the first answer just because you like it. He tightened the bolt. Then he checked the others around it. One was still secure. Another needed a fraction of a turn. Walter closed the hood. They started the tractor again. He brought the engine slowly back to the same speed. No take. He waited. Still nothing. Evan shook his head. You heard one bolt. Walter smiled faintly. No. He put the tractor into gear. I heard something that wasn't there yesterday. That was the real difference. Walter was not gifted with some mysterious ability to diagnose machinery by sound. He had simply spent enough years with the tractor to know what ordinary sounded like: the steady knock, the gear whine, the vibration through the steering wheel, the way the engine note changed under load, the small noises that belonged there, and the ones that did not. A new operator might have heard the same tick and ignored it. A mechanic might have needed several minutes to locate it. Walter noticed because the noise had entered a pattern that had been unchanged in his memory for years. Experience had given him a baseline. That baseline was more valuable than intuition. By noon, the temperature climbed. Walter stopped every few hours to clean dust from the radiator and check the tractor over. Evan no longer complained. He had begun watching Walter more closely. Not the repairs. The decisions before the repairs. Why he smelled the engine compartment after a hard pull. Why he touched the wheel hubs with the back of his fingers. Why he checked for fresh oil after parking. Why he listened to the idle before shutting the tractor down. Walter was not waiting for parts to break. He was searching for change. At the edge of the field, Evan finally asked, How do you know what matters? Walter looked toward the tractor. You don't? At first. Then how? You remember what happened the last time you ignored it? That answer carried more weight than Evan expected. Walter's knowledge had not come from never making mistakes. It came from paying attention after them. Every failure had left a mark. Some on the tractor, some in his memory. By late afternoon, they completed the final load from Walter's lower field. The old tractor had spent another full day working. Not fast, not effortlessly, but continuously. As they turned toward home, they passed the Mercer place again. The service truck was gone. The modern tractor was running. Evan looked over. Guess they fixed it. Good. You're not disappointed? Walter frowned. Why would I be? Evan shrugged. Kind of ruins the story. Walter laughed once. This isn't a story. He pointed toward the dark line of clouds building west of the farm. It's harvest. The Mercer tractor was faster, more powerful, better equipped. Walter still knew that. But another fact was becoming harder to ignore. The old tractor did not need to be the best machine in the county. It only needed to remain understandable to the man responsible for keeping it alive. Walter rested one hand on the steering wheel. The engine ran evenly beneath him. No strange tick. No new vibration. For now, nothing had changed. And to Walter, that was exactly what he wanted to hear. By Thursday morning, the forecast had stopped using the word chance. Rain was coming. Heavy rain. Not a passing shower. A front wide enough to shut fields down for days. The county weather station put its arrival sometime after midnight. That gave every farmer in the valley less than 18 useful hours. By 6, every machine that could move was moving. Combines were already in the corn. Grain carts ran between fields and bins. Trucks lined up near the elevator. Nobody waved much that morning. There was no time. Walter checked the western sky once, then climbed onto the old tractor. Evan stood beside him with his phone. Stormline moved faster. How much? Maybe 11 tonight. Walter nodded. Then we work until we can't. They started. The tractor settled into the same rhythm it had held all week. Load. Pull. Unload. Return. Evan watched the tachometer. You could give it more throttle. Walter shook his head. Could? Then why not? Because I need it at 8 tonight, more than I need 5 extra minutes now. That was something Walter had learned, the expensive way, when time became scarce. People tried to recover it by forcing machines to work harder. Sometimes that helped. Sometimes heat climbed. Belts slipped. Bearings ran hotter. And small weaknesses were given exactly what they needed to become failures. Walter kept the tractor inside the range he knew. Not slow. Not strained. Steady. Odzicie, szeptes prezecie. A pickup from the Franklin place stopped near the gate. The driver leaned out. Mercer's cart tractor is down again. Evan turned. What happened? Electrical fault? Won't shift right. Then the truck was gone. Evan looked at Walter. That's the second time. Yes. Still think their tractor's better? Walter glanced across the valley. When it's running, it can move twice what this one can. Then what are we proving? Nothing. Walter eased into the next turn. We're trying to finish. By noon, Mercer's tractor was still parked. A service pickup sat beside it. 2 technicians worked near the cab. One carrying a diagnostic unit. The machine showed no obvious damage. No broken belt. No leaking hose. No smoke. Just a very expensive tractor sitting perfectly still. Evan kept looking toward it. Walter understood why. His own tractor usually showed its trouble. A leak could be seen. A loose linkage could be felt. A belt could be checked by hand. Mercer's problem might already be identified. But that did not mean the men standing beside it could repair it without the right software. Par? Or service procedure. That was not weakness. It was dependence of a different kind. At doi, patruzec. Walter stopped. Evan's head snapped around. What now? Temperature. The gauge had climbed higher than Walter liked. Not dangerous. Not yet. Walter shut the engine down anyway. They opened the hood. Chaff had begun matting across the radiator fins. Evan looked toward the remaining field. We don't have time. Walter reached for the air hose mounted on the wagon. That's why we're doing it. They cleaned the radiator, checked coolant, checked belt tension. 11 minutes later, the tractor was moving again. The temperature dropped back into its normal range. At 4, Mercer's tractor finally returned to work. Nearly 5 hours lost. Nobody celebrated that. Not Walter. Not Evan. Everyone in the valley understood the same thing now. A broken hour was still a broken hour, whether the machine had cost $5,000 or $300,000. By 6, the wind had strengthened from the west. Corn leaves turned pale, undersides toward the sky. Dust moved low across the road. Walter's tractor had been working nearly 12 hours. Slowly, load after load. Across the valley, Mercer's machine had already begun making up lost time. It moved grain faster than Walter ever could. Evan watched it, then looked back at the faded hood in front of him. For the first time, he understood Walter's real advantage. It was not power. It was not efficiency. It was not that the old tractor broke less. It was that when something changed, Walter usually knew where to begin before the machine had fully stopped. At szepte, tres prezecie. Thunder rolled across the valley. Walter looked toward the final section, then at the fuel gauge, then at the temperature. 2 more loads. Evan looked west. Think we have time? Walter put the tractor into gear. We have whatever time the machine gives us. By 8 that evening, the valley had changed color. The last light had gone yellow beneath the clouds. Dust hung close to the ground. Far to the west, lightning flashed behind the ridge without sound. Walter's tractor was still moving. Not fast. Never fast. But moving. Evan had stopped counting the trips. The rhythm had taken over. Field. Wagon. Road. Unload. Back again. Every trip looked almost identical to the one before it. But Walter treated none of them casually. At the edge of the field, he glanced at the gauges. At the road crossing, he listened to the engine under load. At the unloading point, he walked once around the tractor while Evan handled the wagon. Touched the hub. Checked the hitch. Look underneath. Smell for heat. Then back into the seat. Evan finally said, "You do that every time?" Walter climbed up. "Every time I remember. That's not what I asked." Walter looked at him. Then yes. The tractor had been running nearly 14 hours. On a modern machine. 14 hours was not extraordinary. On Walter's machine, 14 hours meant 14 hours of heat, vibration, dust, and metal working against metal. That was exactly why he kept checking it. The old tractor had no margin for neglect. Its reliability did not come from being indestructible. It came from never being ignored for very long. They pulled another load from the field. The engine note deepened on the slope. Walter eased the throttle slightly and chose a lower gear. Evan looked over. "We're losing speed. We're keeping temperature." The gauge had started to rise again. Not enough to stop. Enough to matter. Walter had spent most of his life learning the difference between those two things. A machine could work hard. It did not have to be abused. Across the road, Mercer's newer tractor was back in full operation. The repair had been made. It was moving grain much faster than Walter. Within an hour, it completed several trips. Walter watched it pass once. Then again, Evan followed it with his eyes. "They're catching up." Walter nodded. "Good." Evan smiled. "You really hate competing, don't you?" Walter looked toward the storm. "I hate wasting time on the wrong competition." The real competition was above them. Adopt, Patruzeci, Shishase. Rain began falling 5 miles west. Evan watched the weather radar on his phone. Red and yellow bands crawled toward the county line. Maybe an hour. Walter looked toward the remaining rows. "One load after this? You sure?" "No." That answer had become familiar too. Walter rarely pretended certainty where none existed. They loaded again. The tractor pulled hard. Halfway to the road, a faint smell of hot rubber reached Walter. He stopped. Evan's shoulders dropped. Again? Walter climbed down. This time the problem was simple. The fan belt was running warmer than before. Not broken, not even badly worn, but loose enough that Walter did not trust it for another full trip under load. He opened the toolbox. Evan looked toward the storm. "How long? If the bolt cooperates." "10 minutes." Walter loosened the generator mount, adjusted the belt tension, tightened everything again, then checked the alignment. 8 minutes. He started the engine. The belt tracked cleanly. Temperature stable. They moved. That small stop might have looked like lost time. Walter saw it differently. 8 minutes now was cheaper than a broken belt. 20 minutes later, the final wagon filled under a sky that had gone almost black. Evan climbed beside Walter. "That's it?" Walter looked behind them. For this field, they pulled toward the road. The old tractor rattled over the same gravel it had crossed all week. Its headlights were dim. Its paint was dull. Its engine sounded tired. So did Walter. But both were still working. They passed the Mercer entrance. One of the men who had laughed beside Walter's road days earlier stood near the gate. This time he did not laugh. He watched the old tractor go by. Walter raised one hand. The man raised his back. Nothing else was said. There was nothing left to explain. The proof was not that Walter's tractor had beaten the newer machines. It had not. The newer machines had done more work. Faster. But Walter's old tractor had done something nobody had expected. It had kept returning, hour after hour, problem after problem, and every time it threatened to stop, Walter had understood enough to bring it back. At 9:31. They unloaded the final wagon. The first hard drops of rain struck the roof of the shed. Walter shut the tractor down. The engine ticked as it cooled. For the first time all day, the farm became quiet. Evan stood beside the hood. You know what's weird? Walter waited. I kept expecting it to quit. Walter placed one hand on the tractor. So did I. Evan looked at him. Walter smiled. That's why I kept listening. The rain stopped before dawn, but it left the field soft. Too soft for heavy equipment in the low ground. Walter knew that before he even stepped outside, he could smell it. Wet soil. Cold air. The heavy stillness that followed a night of hard rain. He poured coffee and stood by the kitchen window. Across the road, the Mercer yard was already lit. Headlights moved between buildings. Someone was working early. Evan came in pulling on his jacket. You going out? Walter shook his head. Not yet. Thought we were done. We are. Evan looked toward the window. Then why are you dressed? Walter took another drink. Habit. Achaze. 32. A pickup turned into the driveway. Walter recognized it immediately. Daniel Mercer stepped out. He was one of the men who had stood by the road at the beginning of harvest. The one who had asked whether Walter was really planning to take the old tractor into the field. Daniel walked toward the porch slowly. No smile. No joke. Walter opened the door before he knocked. Morning? Daniel nodded. Morning. For a few seconds. Neither man said anything. Then Daniel looked past Walter toward the shed. That tractor fueled? Walter glanced toward it. Yes. Daniel rubbed his jaw. We've got a problem. Walter waited. One of the lower fields didn't get finished before the rain. How much? Not much. Maybe 6 acres. Walter nodded. That ground holds water. I know. Daniel looked toward the road. Our cart tractor's too heavy to take in there right now. Combine can work the high side. But I don't want the grain cart cutting ruts through the bottom. Walter understood. A large modern tractor was useful because it could pull enormous loads, but weight was still weight. Wet soil changed the rules. You want mine? Daniel hesitated. I want to know if yours can pull the smaller wagon. Walter looked at him. Empty or full? Half loads. That field flat? Mostly. Walter took one more sip of coffee. Then yes. Daniel looked relieved. I'll pay you. Walter shook his head. We'll talk about that later. Evan had been listening from the kitchen. As Daniel walked back toward his truck, he stepped beside Walter. You're helping him? Yes. The guy who laughed at you? Walter turned. He laughed at a tractor. Same thing. No. Walter put his cup down. Not even close. 20 minutes later, the old machine came out of the shed. The rain had washed the dust from its hood. For the first time all week, the faded red paint almost looked bright. Daniel had brought over a smaller grain wagon. Walter inspected the hitch, checked the tires, looked over the load rating. Then he connected it. Evan climbed beside him. You realize how this looks. Walter started the engine. How? The antique coming to rescue the expensive equipment. Walter gave him a sharp glance. Don't make it stupid. Evan laughed. Walter pointed toward Mercer's field. Their combine still does the harvesting. He tapped the hood beneath his hand. This just does one job their bigger tractor shouldn't do today. That distinction mattered. Walter's tractor had not become more powerful overnight. It had not suddenly become more efficient. It had become useful because the conditions had changed. The Mercer combine worked the firmer ground at the upper edge. The smaller wagon filled only halfway. Walter kept the load light. He stayed off the softest sections, where the soil darkened. He changed his line. Where the wagon began to pull harder, he slowed instead of adding throttle. Daniel watched from the field entrance. The first load came out clean. No deep ruts. No spinning tires. The second did too. By the third trip, something had changed. Not in the tractor. In the way people looked at it. Nobody laughed when it passed. Nobody called it junk. The machine was still slow. Still out. Still nearly 80 years old. But now every trip out of that wet field carried something more than grain. It carried proof. At noon, the final section was finished. Daniel walked up while Walter was unhitching the wagon. I owe you. Walter shook his head. You'll return the favor someday. Daniel looked at the tractor. I was wrong about that thing. Walter wiped mud from the drawbar. No. Daniel frowned. Walter stood. You were right about most of it. It's old. Yes. Slow. Yes. Underpowered. Definitely. Daniel smiled. Then what was I wrong about? Walter closed the toolbox. You thought old meant useless. Daniel looked at the tractor again. Walter walked toward the shed. Behind him, the old engine clicked softly as it cooled. For the first time, to the machine. Everyone expected to die had become the machine somebody else had come looking for. By late afternoon, Walter thought harvest was over. Then Daniel Mercer called. There was one field left. Not 6 acres this time. Closer to 9. Higher ground. Mostly firm. But the Weather Service had issued another warning. A second band of rain was expected before midnight. Heavier than the first. Daniel's combine could finish cutting it. The problem was moving grain out fast enough. One of his trucks had been delayed at the elevator. The large cart tractor was tied up on the other side of the farm. Walter looked toward his shed. The old tractor sat exactly where he had left it. Mud dried along the rear tires. Dust clung beneath the hood. It had already worked more hours that week than Walter had planned to ask from it. So had he. His right knee hurt every time he bent it. His shoulders felt heavy. There was a dull ache running from the base of his neck into his left arm from days of steering. Climbing, lifting, and crawling underneath machinery. Evan saw him looking at the tractor. You don't have to go. Walter nodded. I know. That wasn't a suggestion. Walter turned toward him. Evan continued. You've done your field? You helped Mercer. Nobody's asking you to prove anything. Walter looked west. The clouds were beginning to stack above the ridge. This isn't about proving anything. 20 minutes later, the tractor was running. They reached Mercer's final field shortly before 6. The combine was already moving. Daniel had arranged 2 smaller wagons, so Walter would never pull more weight than the tractor could safely handle. That mattered. Walter refused to turn the old machine into something. It was not just because everyone was in a hurry. Half loads. Lower gear. No hard acceleration. No shortcuts across the soft drainage strip near the center of the field. The first trip went cleanly. So did the second. On the third, Walter noticed the temperature gauge beginning to rise. He stopped near the field entrance. Evan looked at the sky. We're losing light. We'll lose more if it overheats. They opened the hood. Chaff had collected across the radiator again. Walter cleaned it while Evan checked the belt. 7 minutes later, they were moving. Besiedem, 40. Darkness had settled across the field. The tractor's headlights reached only a short distance ahead. Beyond them, the combine moved like a wall of light through the corn. Walter's machine looked tiny beside it. Ancien. Almost absurd. But every time the wagon filled, Walter was there. Every time the combine needed space, he cleared the lane. Every time the tractor began pulling harder, he changed gears before the engine asked him to. The work became less about speed and more about not making a mistake. At 8:30, Walter climbed down and nearly lost his balance. Evan caught his arm. You okay? My knee. That's enough. Walter stood still for several seconds. Evan was no longer joking. Let me drive. Walter looked at the tractor. Then at Evan. You know the clutch? Yes. The temperature? Watch it. The slope by the south fence? Stay high. Walter handed him the seat. It was the first time all week. For the next load, Walter rode beside him. Evan drove cautiously. Too cautiously at first. Then better. Walter said little. Don't fight the wheel. Evan glanced at him. Walter realized he had heard those words before. A lifetime earlier. From his father. The final wagon began filling at 9:18. Lightning flashed beyond the ridge. Daniel stood near the combine, watching the sky. Nobody spoke. The grain poured. Walter listened to the old tractor idle beneath them, uneven for a moment, then steady. The wagon reached its safe load. Evan started forward, halfway to the road. The first rain struck the windshield of Daniel's pickup behind them. Then more, large drops hitting dust, turning it dark. Walter looked back at the field. The combine was coming out, That was it. No dramatic finish. No cheering. Just machines leaving before the ground became something they could no longer work. At nowa, patruzeci shapte. Evan pulled the wagon beneath the shed roof. He shut the tractor down. The engine stopped with one final shudder. Rain hammered the metal roof above them. For several seconds, neither man moved. Walter placed his hand on the hood. It was hot, iscarad, still vibrating slightly as the metal cooled. Evan looked at him. 70 years old? Walter nodded. Evan tapped the hood. Almost 80. Walter smiled, both showing it. Outside, the final field disappeared behind the rain. A week earlier, people had looked at Walter and the tractor and seen two things beyond their prime. Now Evan understood the mistake. Past your prime did not always mean finished. Sometimes it only meant you could no longer waste strength. You had to know exactly where to use what remained. The rain lasted through the night. By morning, the fields were dark and heavy with water. No machines moved. No wagons rattled down the road. No engines carried across the valley. For the first time in more than a week, the farm was quiet. Walter woke before 5 anyway. Habit. He dressed, made coffee, and walked to the shed while the sky was still gray. The old tractor sat where Evan had parked it. Mud on the tires, dust trapped beneath the fenders. A thin line of oil marked one side of the engine. Nothing serious. Walter stood beside it for a long moment. Then he began cleaning, not because anyone was coming to see it, not because the work needed to be done immediately, because harvest was not finished until the machine was put away properly. He wiped dirt from the hood, checked the oil, looked underneath for leaks, loosened the radiator screen, and cleaned away the last packed layer of chaff. Then he opened the toolbox. The worn clutch pin from earlier in the week was still inside. Walter picked it up, a piece of steel barely longer than his thumb. Cheap. Ordinary. Yet that little piece could have stopped an entire day. He set it on the workbench. Evan came in sometime after 7. You seriously couldn't sleep? Walter kept cleaning. I slept. For what? 3 hours? Enough. Evan shook his head and leaned against the bench. For a while, he watched. Then he looked at the tractor. You think Daniel still wants to buy this thing? Walter smiled. Not after watching it all week. He might pay more now. Then definitely not. Evan laughed. The shed became quiet again. Finally, he asked, how much longer do you think it can keep going? Walter stopped wiping the hood. It was the kind of question people had been asking for years. Usually they meant the tractor. Sometimes Walter suspected they meant him. He looked over the machine carefully. The cracked steering wheel, the faded paint, the patched seat, the bolts marked with old wrench scars. It was not young. It was not strong by modern standards. It would need more work, more parts, more attention, and eventually, some repair would cost more than the machine could reasonably justify. Walter knew that. Age did not disappear because a man respected it. He placed the rag on the bench. Depends. On what? On whether we keep asking it to do the jobs it can still do. Evan considered that. Walter continued. You put it on a job that needs 200 horsepower. It's useless. He tapped the hood. You ask it to pull a reasonable load. Keep it cool. Fix what wears out. He shrugged. It may surprise you. Evan looked at him. Sounds like you're talking about yourself. Walter smiled. Maybe. That afternoon, Daniel Mercer stopped by. He carried no tools, no parts, no emergency, just 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Walter and looked at the tractor. You know, I thought that thing was done. Walter took the cup. It almost was. A few times, Daniel laughed. I'm serious. So any. Daniel ran a hand along the fender. My new tractor did more work in one day than this probably did all week. Probably. But when it stopped, Walter finished the thought. You needed somebody else. Daniel nodded. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Daniel asked, how long you think she'll keep going? Walter looked at Evan. Evan already knew the answer. Walter turned back to Daniel. As long as somebody still knows how to listen. Daniel smiled, but Evan did not. He understood what Walter meant. Listening was not nostalgia. It was maintenance. Attention. Knowing what normal sounded like, knowing when to stop, knowing when to repair, knowing when to push, and knowing when not to. A week earlier, people had looked at Walter and the tractor and seen two things beyond their best years. They were not entirely wrong. Walter could no longer work the way he had at 40. The tractor could never compete with modern equipment on speed or power, but that was not the same as having nothing left to offer. That season had proven something quieter. The old tractor still had value because Walter understood its limits. Walter still had value because he had spent a lifetime learning limits of weather, soil, machinery, and himself. And perhaps the clearest proof of that came on the final night. When his body had reached its limit, he had handed the wheel to Evan. Not because Walter had failed, because he finally understood that keeping something alive did not always mean being the one who drove it forever. Sometimes it meant teaching another person how to listen. Walter closed the shed doors. Behind them, the tractor rested in the dark. Not retired, not immortal, just ready for whatever job still made sense next.